"Step away from the casket," Officer Reed Walker shouted at the center of a military funeral, drawing his gun and aiming it straight at a black woman who was bowing her head before the flag-draped coffin. The entire cemetery froze as she looked up, sunlight catching the silver shoulder boards, a general's star gleaming bright. In the moment he prepared to pull the trigger, he realized who he was humiliating: Major General Selene Ward, the woman who had once commanded thousands of soldiers he called heroes. Honor has nothing to do with skin color. It lies in how a person confronts power and defends dignity. What state are you in where honor is guarded by the barrel of a gun or by the strength of respect? Noon at Arlington National Cemetery burned white under a harsh sun, rows of American flags rippling evenly against a pale blue sky. Black draped chairs formed clean lines, and at the center of the plaza, a coffin lay on a wooden platform. Its folded flag perfectly creased the thick fabric, catching the light like a solemn farewell. The funeral bugle played low and steady, each note like the final breath of a soldier returning to the motherland. The honor guard stood in formation, uniforms crisp on their shoulders, eyes fixed on the flag slowly descending in silence. No one spoke, only the wind moved through the endless white gravestones. In the midst of it, a black woman in a dark military dress stood a few steps from the honor line, her face, calm hand resting on a white bouquet placed next to a pair of old but polished shoes. Officer Reed Walker had just passed through the security gate, holding a radio in one hand, eyes scanning the crowd without much interest. He was used to this scene: tearful ceremonies, folded flags, farewells he never really listened to. Today felt the same, except his gaze paused on that woman, her upright stance, her shoulders unbothered by the sun. She wore no guest tag, no family badge on her chest, and that alone made him frown. He walked toward her slowly, the click of his heels tapping against the concrete, cutting through the funeral music. People nearby glanced over, some briefly met eyes before turning away. Reed stopped a few steps from her and spoke with a dry, disdainful voice. "This area's for authorized personnel only. You people always push your luck." She turned her head slightly, sunlight brushing across her sun-worn cheek. Her eyes held no fear, no anger, only the steady calm of someone who had seen death so many times that nothing could shake her anymore. "My luck died on the battlefield, officer." She said, her voice low and firm, every word hitting the ground like a stone. The air grew heavier around them, and though the bugle still played, it suddenly sounded caught in the chest. Reed paused for a second, then gave a half smile, the kind men wear when they think they're still in charge. He noticed a few people watching and lowered his voice just enough to be heard. "Lady, don't start drama in front of the dead." The woman didn't respond. She simply bent down to pick up a small card the wind had knocked from the bouquet. It read, "For my brothers in arms." She placed it back and smoothed it flat, her eyes not on him, but on the flag flying over the coffin. Reed assumed she was ignoring the order, and irritation began to swell in his chest. Ever since being assigned to a funeral detail, he'd believed security came first and anyone who crossed that line was a threat. But in the glare of that harsh sun, his anger shifted into a vague discomfort, not because she defied him, but because of the way she stood there, calm to the point of isolation. He took another step, his voice heavier. "You hear me, ma'am? Step back now." She still didn't move, only tilted her head just enough to see the badge on his chest. "I heard you," she said, "but I don't move for disrespect." A few veterans in the nearby rows shifted in their seats. No one spoke, but the way they looked had begun to change. Reed frowned, sweat forming along his temple, and the funeral music suddenly felt mocking. The bugle stretched its notes long and slow, interrupted only by the heavy breathing of two people locked in a quiet standoff. Sunlight slid across her shoulder, glinting off the silver stars on her collar. Reed didn't notice, but some of the soldiers nearby did. One member of the honor guard started to step forward, but she raised her hand gently to stop him, eyes still fixed on the officer. "You're trembling, officer," she said softly. "Is it the sun or the fear of being wrong?" Her voice was low, but the words cut like a blade through pride. Reed clenched his jaw, teeth grinding out a faint sound. "Don't test me," he growled. "I'm not," she replied. "I'm reminding you where you stand." The space between them thickened with silence. Flags snapped sharply above as a few people in the back rows quietly raised their phones. Reed felt the weight of eyes on him, the judgment in their gaze pressing hard into his skin. He leaned slightly, fingers brushing his holster, not drawn just enough to let her see the power hanging in the air. She looked at his hand with the calm of someone who'd seen this scene 100 times, then said, "You came to protect this ceremony, not disgrace it." The wind picked up, knocking hats from heads and stirring the flag's edges in the sun. An older officer standing at a distance dropped his gaze, sensing control slipping from the moment. Reed stepped back half a pace, suddenly aware that every eye was on him. He inhaled deeply, exhaling through clenched teeth, still trying to look imposing, though his hand on the grip was beginning to shake. She said nothing more, just turned her eyes to the flag, being folded, two soldiers, working slowly, crease by crease, as if holding the soul of the fallen. The bugle played on deep and weighty, vibrating through air thick as smoke. A white petal fell from the bouquet at her feet, rolling slowly across the concrete and coming to rest between them. Reed looked at it and saw, reflected in his own eyes, her figure. Not tall, not large, but standing firm and still like a marker in the storm. He didn't know why, but something rose in his chest, part anger, part fear. She bent, picked up the petal, placed it back in its spot, and said quietly, "Some things deserve silence, officer." Then she turned, standing tall, one hand over her heart. The funeral bugle lowered its song, the final notes drifting past like thin smoke. Reed watched her, feeling power slip away, leaving behind a cold hollowness like the blazing noon sun over Arlington. Wind swept up from the southern lawn, carrying dust and dry leaves swirling around the straight rows of white headstones. The funeral bugle had just ended, and in the brief silence meant for breath, Reed's voice rang out sharp and loud, like a whip cracking through solemn air. "You're impersonating military staff, aren't you?" He marched forward, face flushed under the sun, hand still hovering near his gun. A few members of the honor guard shifted slightly, but none stepped in. All eyes were on them now, drawn into the rising tension. Selene held her ground, hair moving gently in the breeze, fingers clenched around a silver medal in her pocket, her eyes quiet but edged with the cold light of someone who had faced real danger. Reed came closer, his voice cutting over the wind. "Answer me, ma'am. What's your rank? Who authorized you to stand here?" She didn't answer immediately. Her gaze swept the scene, soldiers bowing their heads to the folded flag, the ache of loss still hanging in each breath. "You wouldn't understand," she said, her voice low and steady as if speaking to the ground beneath her feet. The sentence made him laugh, a dry, bitter sound. "You think wearing black makes you invisible here. You people never stop pretending you belong." The last words landed hard, echoing between the graves. A few mourners in the distance turned their faces a mix of confusion and anger. Selene didn't react, her eyes still on the coffin being lowered. Sunlight hit her hand knuckles, taut, dark skin reflecting the muted silver from her pocket. Reed clenched his teeth, feeling like he was speaking to a statue. He yanked the mourning ribbon from her wrist and threw it to the ground. "You see that line? That's where civilians stay. Step back now." His breath reeked of cigarettes and fury. Another gust of wind rolled through, lifting the ribbon and tumbling it across the gravel path until it stopped at the feet of an older veteran. The man bent to pick it up, looked at both of them, then held it tightly in his hand, silent. Selene raised her head and looked straight at Reed. The light caught her eyes, turning their dark brown into a fierce amber. "No," she said, voice low and clear, each word sharp. "I think your eyes were never trained to see honor." A gust swept through, and the flag snapped against its pole like metal clashing. Everyone nearby froze. A few phones were lifted discreetly. Someone drew in a breath and held it, afraid that even the smallest movement would shatter the silence that had fallen. He stepped back half a pace, then forced out a mocking smile. "Honor, don't use big words you don't understand. This is a military funeral, not a charity march." She remained calm, only tilting her head slightly. Her voice turned colder. "That's why I'm here to mourn those who did understand." Reed blinked, unsure why it felt like the ground had shifted beneath him. For a second, he saw around him hundreds of identical headstones, all silent, all blind and white. Sweat dripped down his neck as he tried to reclaim control. "Show me your badge, or get out," he barked, his voice cracking across the empty plaza. Selene pulled her hand from her pocket, holding the silver metal sunlight flashing off the polished surface, but she didn't raise it. "I don't need to prove where I belong," she said, turning her eyes toward the casket, where two soldiers were lowering it. Reed caught the gleam of the metal and took it as provocation. He moved in fast, reaching to snatch it. She leaned away, her voice quiet but firm. "Don't touch me, officer." They both froze, inches apart, breath mingling in the tense space. He squinted, speaking in a low, sharp tone. "You're obstructing an investigation." The words made a few people nearby gasp. An older woman shook her head. "Investigation? She's just standing there." Reed turned to her, voice tight with strain. "Stay out of this." Selene saw the fear and confusion behind his eyes, then spoke slowly. "You're not investigating anything. You're trying to protect your pride." Her words peeled away the last layer he had left. Reed swallowed hard, stepped in back again, then shouted, "Security over here!" But no one came. The security staff in the distance stayed where they were, eyes unsure. They had seen everything and knew this wasn't about security anymore. It was a test of character. Selene looked around and saw everyone watching. Their silence carried a charge of disbelief. She exhaled softly, then turned back to Reed, her voice quiet but clear. "You've mistaken authority for honor. They're not the same." The words pulled the sound from the entire space. Reed clenched his jaw, but his throat was dry and no words came out. All he could hear now was the wind tearing through the flags and the click of camera shutters. A freelance reporter had just arrived from the left side, snapping photo after photo, eyes locked on the unfolding scene. Reed looked around and realized he had become the center of attention. The feeling doubled his anger. He pointed at Selene, voice cracking one last time. "Show me your badge." She didn't move, only opened the hand holding the metal flashing in the sunlight, reflecting his image with the gun at his hip. "Here's my badge," she said quietly. "Earned, not given." Then she closed her hand, turned, and walked toward the casket. Reed stood frozen, his hand clenched, feeling choked by the harsh midday light. The woman walked slowly, each step steady. When she stopped, the funeral bugle sounded again, long and mournful, so beautiful it ached. The wind rose once more, sweeping yellow dust over Reed's shoes. He remained in place, hearing the clicks of cameras, hearing someone whisper, "That's going viral." In that moment, he understood every word he had said was gone with the wind. All that remained was the image of that woman calm in a sacred place, and the last sentence still echoing in his mind. "Your eyes were never trained to see honor." Above them, the American flag snapped fiercely in the shifting wind, the noon sunlight casting streaks of light and shadow across the ground. The crowd around the casket began to murmur quiet voices, mingling with the sound of fabric striking metal. The solemn silence of the funeral had been broken, and all eyes turned toward the two figures facing off before the headstones. Officer Reed Walker clenched his fists, trying to steady his voice, but the anger inside him surged past reason. He deliberately raised his voice so everyone could hear. "Lady, don't raise your tone in front of soldiers. You don't belong here." His words rang out, laced with the smugness of someone who believed his authority was absolute. A few guests in the back rows turned surprised, some covering their mouths. Selene remained still, her hair drifting slightly in the wind, light catching her cheekbone in a sharp, cold line. She turned to face Reed, her eyes deep and strangely calm. "I buried more soldiers than you'll ever salute," she said, her voice steady and slow, each word landing heavy like the soil being laid over the casket behind her. A veteran in the front row heard her tighten his grip on his cap and looked at her with a flicker of recognition. Reed froze, then forced a mocking laugh, masking his discomfort with arrogance. "Is that supposed to impress me?" he said, stepping closer. The wind picked up, kicking sand into the air, the scent of old gunpowder lingering as if from past ceremonies. Selene said nothing. Her gaze dropped to the invitation in her hand, a document bearing the seal of the Department of Defense authorizing her presence at the service. Reed saw it, then suddenly snatched the paper from her hand before anyone could react. The sound of tearing paper cracked through the heavy air. He ripped it cleanly in two, tossed the pieces to the ground, and sneered. "There, now you're officially out of place." A sharp breath came from the nearby crowd. Someone in the honor guard frowned, but stayed still. Selene's eyes followed the two halves of the paper as they spun in the wind, one piece landing near Reed's polished shoes, the other under the shadow cast by the flag. Her gaze lingered there as if seeing herself insulted, yet still upright. A gust of wind passed through, carrying with it a collective breath no one dared release aloud. She bent down, picked up the torn paper, brushed the dust from it, and held it in her hand. As she rose, her eyes cut across Reed's face. Her voice was soft but clear. "You just tore your dignity, not mine." The words floated like a breeze, but several nearby people shivered. A large flag swept overhead, its shadow covering them both for a brief second like a silent judgment from the very symbol they had just defiled. Reed squinted, the smile on his lips fading. He wasn't used to being diminished in front of a crowd, especially by someone he considered unworthy. "Big words for someone trespassing," he said, his voice tightening as he stepped closer. "You're lucky I'm patient." Selene didn't move. She tilted slightly, her voice low and even. "Patience doesn't come from authority, officer. It comes from discipline." The words made his face twitch, a red line rising along his neck. By now, everyone in the front rows had fully turned around their eyes, a mix of shock and unease. A middle-aged man stood and tried to speak to Reed. "Officer, please, this is a funeral. Let it go." But Reed brushed the comment aside without turning. "Stay seated, sir. I'm handling a security breach." He moved closer, his shadow falling across Selene's face. Still, she held her head high, light bouncing off the silver stars on her collar, making them blaze. The wind surged, and the flag behind them flapped hard against the pole, the sound mixing with the rapid clicks of distant cameras. Reed noticed the lenses aimed at him. The feeling of being watched only heightened his tension. He snapped, "What's your name?" She answered, her tone icy. "The kind you'll only learn when you respect it." The reply hit hard, leaving him speechless, blood pounding in his ears. He bent down, intending to grab the remaining half of the torn paper and throw it away. But the wind caught it, lifting it from his hand and sending it spiraling up until it lodged in the flagpole. The paper fluttered violently, the words "Military Honors Invitation" clearly visible. The sight struck like a slap, and several in the crowd gasped. Selene kept her gaze steady. This time, her voice came like a quiet reminder. "Every word you said will echo under that flag." Reed opened his mouth to respond, but just then, the ceremonial speaker's voice cut through the air, announcing the name of the deceased. The tone was hoarse but solemn. Lieutenant Marcus Hale for his service and courage. The honor guard fired 3 rounds each shot, thundering through the hearts of everyone present. In the middle of that sound, Reed stood still, unsure why his chest felt tight. She turned her head, placed a hand over her hard eyes on the flag, and her voice drifted gently with the wind. "Rest well, soldier." As the sound of the final gunshot faded, Reed remained in place, his face burning hot. The soldiers in the honor formation had lowered their rifles and bowed their heads. A single, white petal rolled to a stop at the tip of his boot, like the last note of a sorrowful song. Selene looked at him one last time, her gaze steady and clear, and said just loud enough for him to hear, "One day you'll learn the difference between power and worth." Then she turned and walked toward the flag-covered casket being slowly lowered into the ground. Reed watched her go, a stinging sensation crawling up his neck. The wind shifted and the torn piece of paper caught on the flagpole, fell, touched the ground, slid past his shoe, and came to rest beside the shadow cast by the flying flag. He bent down and saw the faded words still visible through the dust, "For those who gave everything." In that moment, the woman's voice echoed somewhere above him, still lingering in the air. "You just tore your dignity, not mine." The flag struck the pole again, sharp and dry, like a warning meant for the one who had just dishonored the symbol he had sworn to protect. The midday sun hit the rows of headstones, medal on badges, and weapons, reflecting a glare sharp enough to sting the eyes. The wind carried heat across the open yard, the smell of burnt grass and dust mixing into a heavy air that coated the funeral. Reed Walker took another step forward, heart-pounding sweat gathering around his neck. The feeling of being challenged in front of everyone made him furious. His voice came out hoarse and urgent. "Back off, now." He placed his hand on the grip of his gun body, leaning forward like someone about to charge into an unwinnable fight. The sound of boots hitting concrete echoed dry and hard, blending with the faint traces of military music still drifting in the wind. Selene Ward remained still. The wind swept her hair, back her dark uniform shifting slightly. She looked up at him, her eyes calm, not afraid, but carrying a steady presence that unsettled more than fear ever could. "You're trembling, officer," she said slowly. "Maybe fear doesn't need a reason." Her voice moved cleanly through the space between them, colder than the wind. Reed froze for half a second, then clenched his jaw. Her words made him feel stripped down, like every layer of false authority had been peeled away in front of watching eyes. "I said, back off," he shouted, ripping the gun from its holster. The metal flashed, catching the white-hot sun, the barrel aimed directly at the woman's chest. Silence stretched unbroken only by the wind rattling the flagpole. The crowd stood frozen. A few gasped and others raised their hands to their mouths. An older officer behind them shouted his voice, cracking, "Put that gun down, son," but Reed didn't hear it. Every sound but his heartbeat disappeared. He saw her face, saw eyes that didn't flinch even with the barrel pointed at her heart. He waited for fear for her to lower her head, for any reaction that would prove he still held control. But Selene stayed still and spoke quietly. "That's how you show your courage, by aiming at what you don't understand." His lips tightened, sweat soaking his palm. The gun shook slightly in his hand, catching the light like a blade. The crowd began to stir. Some people raised their phones, others lifted cameras, capturing the moment unfolding in a sacred place. An older woman among the mourners began to cry softly, her trembling hand resting on the flag. From a distance, the low, steady thrum of a military helicopter echoed, sounding like a warning from the sky. Reed stepped back half a pace, the barrel still aimed forward. "Don't move," he barked, his voice rough and strained. She looked him straight in the eye and spoke loud enough for all to hear. "Every soldier buried here died so you could point that gun safely. Think about that before you pull the trigger." A young veteran couldn't take it anymore and yelled, "That's enough." Then he stepped forward only to be pulled back by his fellow mourners. The air turned thick. Even the wind seemed to stop, afraid to break the moment. Reed felt a weight in his chest, his breath breaking in short bursts. In his head echoed the words from training, "Use control, show dominance." But now the only thing he saw was her eyes that made him feel small and alone. He hissed through his teeth, "You don't tell me what to think," then lowered the gun slightly, holding it just below her stomach, close enough to threaten. A child near the fence cried out, pulled back by his mother. A few freelance reporters pushed in cameras, clicking non-stop, the sound overtaking even the breaths around them. The wind shifted, blowing sand into Reed's face. His anger surged, mixed with shame, fear and the sense that power was slipping through his fingers. Selene raised an eyebrow slightly and spoke low. Now, everyone sees what you protect your ego. He glared, finger on the trigger, not pulling, just holding his hand shaking. A silver-haired veteran stepped forward with a cane, his voice trembling but clear. "Lower it, son. This isn't your battlefield." Reed turned and shouted, "Stay back." His eyes flared, voice cracking with rage. "I'm handling a threat." The old man looked at him, eyes wrinkled but sharp. "That woman's a veteran. You're pointing your weapon at the very reason you wear that badge." The words made Reed freeze, but only for a moment. He turned back to Selene, the light reflecting off the silver stars on her shoulder, forcing him to squint. She lowered her voice just enough for him to hear. "You're not afraid of danger. You're afraid of being wrong." He breathed heavily, voice cracking. "You think you're better than me," she answered without hesitation. "No, I just know who I am." The short reply cracked like thunder, stirring murmurs through the crowd. One of the reporters whispered, "She's fearless," and the words spread like fire. Every camera turned toward them. Reed felt pressure crushing his chest. He knew the moment was being captured, knew this image would spread, but his pride wouldn't let him back down. "Put that phone down," he shouted, swinging the gun toward the crowd, making several people scream. A security officer rushed in, but Selene raised her hand to stop him. "Let him finish digging his hole," she said quietly, and the soldier froze eyes on her, part respect, part fear. Heat rose from the ground surrounding them both. Reed stepped back half a pace, turned the gun back toward her, his voice nearly breaking. "You think you can humiliate me?" Selene stared back, her voice slow and heavy. "You're doing it yourself." A strong wind swept through, lifting the flag high behind them, its shadow falling over both the image of the black gun, blending into the red, white, and blue of the national flag. The crowd began to shift, more people raising their phones, and in the distance, police sirens echoed faintly. The sound of helicopters returned, this time closer, as if watching the sky above them. Selene took a deep breath, her eyes narrowing slightly, her voice soft but clear. "If you fire, the flag falls with you." The words hit Reed like a tightening cord in his chest. His hand clenched, then slowly released, his breathing uneven. The old veteran spoke again, his voice raspy but firm. "Put that gun down, son." In that moment, Reed slowly lowered the weapon. Sunlight flashed off the metal, blinding for a second, then dimmed as he bowed his head. The tension that had gripped the space finally broke, cameras still rolling, wind sweeping the hot dust away from them. Selene stood still, her eyes fixed on the flag above, and as the chaos faded into silence, all that remained in people's memory was the image of a shaken officer lowering his weapon before a woman who needed none to disarm him. Thick silence blanketed the cemetery, broken only by the wind brushing through white funeral ribbons, petals peeling away and falling onto the dry earth. The scent of soil, gunpowder, and scorched grass mixed into a choking heaviness. Selene Ward stood at the center of every gaze. Sunlight filtered through the flag's shadow, casting a sharp divide across her face. One half lit, the other dim. In front of her, Reed Walker still held his weapon drawn, finger tight on the trigger, eyes filled with anger and confusion. Sweat ran down his forehead, catching the light off the barrel. Her voice came out thin and cold as a blade. "You're pointing a gun at a folded flag, not at me." A ripple of whispers passed through the crowd. A few members of the honor guard clenched their fists. The words hit like a slap against the silence, waiting to shatter. Reed ground his teeth, his jaw twitching, the sound of his grinding audible in the open space. "You think you can lecture me," he growled, voice hoarse, clawing at the authority slipping through his hand. But the sound wavered, lost in the wind. Selene looked at him, stepped forward once, and the light caught the silver stars on her shoulders, flashing like fire. She stopped just short of the barrel, the space between them no more than a breath. "I don't think," she said, slowly, each word weighted. "I command. The word command cracked through the funeral like a lightning bolt across the harsh blue sky. Every motion stopped. Even the wind seemed to freeze between the rows of white headstones. Reed stood, frozen eyes flickering, the barrel still aimed but his wrist trembling. The old man in the veteran's row bowed his head, lips moving in silent prayer. Younger mourners stepped back, unwilling to stand between the two crossing heat waves. A woman in mourning began to sob, tears landing on the photo of the fallen soldier in her hand. The image, reflecting in the quivering black barrel, pointed toward her. Selene lowered her gaze, not out of fear, but focus. A wind gust lifted a funeral petal, brushing her collar, the fragile piece catching on her silver insignia. She raised her head, eyes locked on his voice, lower but sharper. "You swore to protect, not to disgrace." Reed exhaled hard, the sound laced with anger and confusion. "You don't tell me what disgrace is," he replied, his voice catching. "I'm doing my job." She narrowed her eyes. "Your job isn't to aim at what you don't understand." The words gathered all the heat in the air and packed it into a single point, drawing a collective breath from the crowd that no one dared to release. A funeral bugle suddenly sounded from the far corner, long, low, and mournful, but this time no one bowed their head. All eyes were fixed on the center, where a police officer stood trembling with a gun aimed at a woman still standing tall beneath the flag's shadow. A young man outside the fence raised his phone, the screen capturing the moment, his hands shaking as he realized he was recording something that would shake the entire nation. A live stream caption appeared across the feed. "Officer pulls gun at military funeral, woman stands her ground." Reed caught the reflection of the phone's light on his face. The shame mixed with rage made him choke. "Turn that off," he shouted, his voice cracking, but it was drowned out by the hundreds of shutter clicks from other cameras now rolling. Selene didn't look away. She kept her eyes on him, voice low and cold. "Now everyone can see what you protect." The slanting sunlight revealed streaks of sweat along his cheekbones. His eyes turned red, his mouth open, but no words came out. A nearby veteran whispered, "He's lost it." Someone beside him answered in a shaky voice, "She's not even flinching." The words spread like a small wave, reaching the back rows where the families of the fallen stood silently, hands over their hearts. No one dared to interrupt, but every gaze held the same question. What honor remains when a police officer points a gun beneath a folded flag? Reed swallowed hard, his throat dry, still holding the gun, but his trigger finger no longer tense. The sunlight flashed off the barrel, forcing him to squint, and in that moment, what he saw reflected inside the muzzle made him freeze. The folded flag reversed, touching his own image. Selene noticed the shift in his eyes and spoke softly like a reminder. "You're looking at yourself, officer. The flag is just a mirror." The wind picked up scattering petals from the funeral wreaths as they floated to the ground. A reporter's microphone dropped with a dry, clattering sound. Reed looked down at the barrel, then back up, his eyes full of confusion. "What gives you the right to talk like that?" he asked, his voice broken. Selene answered without hesitation. "The same right that gives you that badge duty." The words made him step back half a pace. His lips moved, but the heat burning through him left him speechless. No one moved. Only the sound of slow-turning cameras remained, light flickering across the faces of the two figures. Wind swept sand over their shoes, across the edges of their uniforms, and over the hat resting silently on the center casket. A soldier in the honor guard quietly removed his cap and bowed his head. The gesture spread gradually like a silent command until the entire plaza followed. Reed saw hundreds of people bowing while he stood, as the only one still holding a gun. The feeling made his wrist tremble, the barrel slowly lowering. Selene said nothing more. She stepped back, once her eyes never leaving him. "Now, officer," she said softly, "breathe." The sound was light but carried far-reaching, everyone standing in silence. He took a deep breath, then exhaled. The gun slipped from his hand and hit the ground with a sharp, dry clack. That sound rippled across the grass, blending with the steady flap of the flag above, forming the final note of a funeral that would be remembered, where honor had a weapon pointed at it and still stood firm like the flag that never falls. Night settled over the city of Burlington, beneath a light rain, streetlights casting pale white reflections on the wet asphalt like cold metal. Inside the police station, the second-floor meeting room was brightly lit with chairs arranged around a long table. The air was thick with the smell of stale coffee and printed paper, heavy with exhaustion. Reed Walker sat at the center of the room, arms folded across his chest, his collar damp with sweat. On the table lay the sealed evidence bag holding the gun. The air conditioner hummed steadily, and the interrogator's voice came even and firm. "Why was your gun drawn?" Reed looked up with dark circles under his eyes, his voice rough from repeating the same answer all day. She was suspicious, he said, eyes fixed on the table. Look out of place. As soon as he spoke, a chair shifted softly. One of the investigators, a young officer, sighed, placing a hand on his notebook. He spoke quietly, but clearly enough for everyone to hear. "You pulled a gun on a soldier, man." Reed squinted, glancing up, his tone dry and rigid. "Don't call her that. She wasn't in uniform." The older officer across the table leaned forward, both hands on the surface, his eyes sharp under the lights. "That's your defense. You pointed a gun at a funeral, in front of cameras." Reed clenched his fists, nails digging into his palms. "I followed protocol." She refused to step back. "I was outnumbered." A brief silence followed, then the interrogator flipped back a page in the file, voice flat. "Outnumbered by who?" "The deceased." The question dropped heavily in the room. Reed swallowed hard, throat tight. "By the crowd, by the noise." The quiet scrape of pen on paper filled the space. A raindrop slipped through the roof edge and hit the floor with a sound like a ticking clock. In the hallway outside, a few officers gathered, peering in through the glass, whispering. They'd seen the video. No one seemed able to find the right word. A younger officer, hair still wet from the rain, murmured, "I saw it live." She didn't even blink. The person beside him replied softly, "He's finished." Inside, Reed caught the vague sound of their voices, and the weight in his chest grew heavier than stone. On the table, the deputy chief's phone lit up, screen filling with constant notifications. He picked it up, thumb sliding across the glass, then turned toward Reed, voice raspy. "It's spreading. You've seen this." He rotated the phone, the light hit in Reed's face, displaying a bold blue headline, "Funeral gun hits 3M views in 6 hours." Below it was a screenshot, him aiming the weapon, sweat rolling down his temple, and the woman standing across from him, hand over her heart, steady like a statue beneath the flag. Reed squinted, his pupils narrowing. "That's edited," he said, voice low. "They're twisting it." The older officer across the table didn't reply, just reached out and turned off the screen, dimming the room. "It doesn't matter if it's edited," he said slowly. "It's what they believe now." Reed pushed his chair back and stood, both hands on the table, breathing hard. "I did my job," he nearly shouted. "You think I wanted to pull my gun? She provoked me. His voice faded as he realized every eye in the room was stone silent. A young officer lowered his head, voice shaken with anger. "You pulled a gun on a woman mourning under the flag. You shamed every badge in this room." The words cut the air like a blade, and Reed dropped back into his chair. The rain outside had picked up, pounding the window in beats like an unsteady heartbeat. The white light cast shadows across his face, revealing the tension carved into his jaw. He tried to speak, but the words caught, leaving only the sound of heavy breathing. The deputy chief opened the file, his tone steady. "We received calls from the Department of Defense. The woman you pointed your gun at, there's a chance she's not just a guest. They're confirming her identity." He paused, eyes fixed on Reed through the dim light. "If that's true, son, you just aimed your weapon at a superior officer." Reed let out a dry laugh. "That's impossible. She's just another activist playing dress-up." His laughter echoed in the small room like shattering glass. A younger cop stood up, his face caught between doubt and conviction. "I've seen that medal before," he said. "That's a silver star. You don't fake that." Reed turned to him, voice sharp. "You think I care what she wears?" He slammed his hand on the table. The noise sent a nearby coffee cup tipping over dark liquid spreading across the surface like a thin trail of blood. The room sank into silence. Moments later, the lead investigator closed the file and spoke softly. "You'll be on leave until further notice. Hand over your badge." Reed stared. "You're suspending me." The answer came short. "We're protecting you from yourself." Reed looked around, his eyes settling on the sealed gun on the table, then slowly reached for the badge on his chest. The sound of metal hitting wood rang out dry and heavy. The door opened and light from the hallway spilled in, illuminating his face for a few seconds. A young officer watched him walk past and whispered to the person beside him, "What happens now?" The reply came quietly, "We wait." The words blended into the sound of rain stretching like the tired breath of the entire building. Reed stepped outside the hallway, stretching long and empty, each footstep echoing behind him. At the end of the corridor, a television screen played the evening news footage of the cemetery with a headline running along the bottom, "Public outrage grows after officer pulls gun at military funeral." He stopped and stared. The woman's face appeared on screen, her expression calm, standing tall beneath the flag, and the caption below the video froze him in place, "Identity under investigation. Rumored to be Major General Selene Ward." Rain slammed against the glass, lightning flashing outside, lighting up Reed's pale face. He took a deep breath, but it broke apart, lost in a room filled only with the hum of fluorescent lights and the cold numbers on the screen. 3 million views in 6 hours. 3 million eyes now seeing him as the face of disgrace. In every coffee shop, office, and train station, the same footage played across TV screens. Officer Reed Walker pointing a gun at a woman during a military funeral. The sound of wind, the flapping flag, and Selene Ward's calm face filled the frame. The scrolling headline cut like a blade, "Public outrage after officer points gun during military funeral." The anchor's voice came slow and clear. Was it racism or just protocol? The question repeated all morning, a chorus spreading across America. Major talk shows opened with heated debates. A white host leaned toward the guest, voice sharp. "Let's be honest, this isn't about protocol. It's about what he saw when he looked at her." Across the table, a former officer pushed back, "Don't turn every mistake into racism. We don't know the full context." But the replayed clip spoke for itself. Reed, shouting his hand, shaking gun aimed at a woman standing still among headstones. The studio audience sat in stunned silence before a wave of boos and applause broke the stillness. Outside the Burlington Police Department, a crowd had gathered early. They held flags, signs, and photos of Selene under the flag printed with bold words, "Respect under the flag." A group of veterans in worn uniforms stood at the front, their faces somber. One held a handwritten sign, "She defended this country," and he aimed at her. Chants echoed off the glass building, spreading like a gust of wind. TV cameras panned across faces, catching furious eyes. Tears and raised fists shouting in unison, "Justice for the General." Inside a small apartment, Reed slumped on a sofa, TV light flickering across his hollow face. The commentator's voice pressed in every word like a needle. Was it fear, prejudice, or abuse of power? He reached to turn it off, but the phone screen lit up on the table, showing the same image. A news app flashed 5 million views, paired with a short clip frozen on the moment he yelled, "Back off now," and drew his weapon. Shame rose to his throat. He grabbed the phone and hurled it to the floor. The crack of plastic echoed like glass breaking. He stood pacing the room, wiping sweat from his forehead, his eyes unsteady. "They don't know what happened," he yelled, his voice bouncing off bare walls. "They don't know how fast things went." The words echoed empty with no one to answer. Out there, The people he once protected were now marching to have his badge stripped. He bent down, picked up the shattered phone, the screen still glowing, showing a flood of comments crashing in like waves. He aimed at the wrong woman and the wrong legacy. Reed read the words over and over, lips pressed tight, chest rising and falling. Legacy, he whispered, his eyes clouding. On the TV, another segment cut to footage of an interview with a silver-haired veteran. The man looked straight into the camera, voice trembling with emotion. I was there. She stood her ground. He was shaken. That woman represented every soldier buried under that flag. The studio audience rose to their feet in applause while Reed's head buzzed, the sounds around him stretching disjointed and chaotic. The door swung open. His old colleague, Sergeant Harris, stepped in, face drawn and tired. You should stay offline, he said softly. They're tearing you apart out there. Reed gave a crooked smile, more grimace than grin. Out there, he said, voice rough. Out there is my job, my people. Harris sighed. Not today. Today they see you as the enemy. Reed turned away, looking out the window where the morning light reflected off the glass, revealing his warped reflection like someone else entirely. From the plaza, the loudspeaker echoed in the voice of a young woman shouting, "No justice, no peace." The chant was returned by hundreds rolling like waves. Harris spoke quiet. They want you suspended permanently. Reed replied, voice almost breaking. It was one mistake. Harris said nothing, his eyes heavy with sympathy. One mistake under a flag is enough to make a nation remember. Reed sank into a chair, both hands over his head, palms slick with sweat. The desk phone rang. He let it go until the fourth ring, then picked up. The reporter's voice came fast and cold. Officer Walker, do you have any comment about the identity of the woman in the video? There are reports she's a major general in active service. He said nothing, only breathing hard through the receiver. No comment, he replied, then hung up. He looked around the room, filled with pale light from a gray morning. On the desk, his police badge lay face down, catching the dull glow from the ceiling. Reed touched it, his fingers pausing on the surface, the cold seeping into his skin. He thought of the years he'd served, of what his father once said, when you wear that badge, it's not yours, it's theirs. Now he understood that theirs had turned away. Outside the window, the crowd kept chanting signs raised in the sun. Online international news outlets began posting headlines, each one, like a knife, repeated across every screen, racist cop points gun at military general. During funeral, in the comments, thousands of shares, hundreds of thousands of likes, and among the flood of words, one pinned comment stood out at the top. He aimed at the wrong woman and the wrong legacy. The sentence glowed cold and final, like a verdict for Reed Walker, sitting alone in a small room, staring out at a flag still flying with no one left saluting beneath its shadow. That afternoon, the Pentagon glowed under the lights of a full press corps. The briefing room was packed with reporters, the sound of mic checks, sharp and jarring camera flashes, bursting like artificial lightning across the blue curtain behind the podium. In the front rows sat major journalists, each holding a microphone, waiting for the moment the country had been talking about for 36 hours. On the large screen behind the stage, the familiar footage replayed the woman standing among white headstones, the flag waving, the officer with his gun raised, people shouting. The video froze at second 32, the moment she lifted her head and the light struck the silver stars on her shoulder. The spokesperson stepped to the podium, voice calm through the mic. After verification by the Department of Defense, the woman in the viral video is Major General Selene Ward, U.S. Strategic Operations. The room erupted in chaos. Camera shutters clicked nonstop. Chairs scraped, voices rose. A female reporter placed a hand over her chest, whispering, "She's a general." Another turned to reply, They said she's retired. No, she's active duty, highest female rank in the division. The room buzzed like a disturbed hive, everyone repeating the same thing. The shock was beyond anything the public had imagined. On the screen, behind them, Selene's image returned not from the funeral but from a medal ceremony at the White House. She stood among other officers, shaking hands with the president, a bright ribbon of medals across her chest. Her smile was calm, her eyes steady. The caption below read, Major General Selene Ward, U.S. Strategic Operations Command. A reporter raised a hand and shouted over the crowd, "Is the officer still on duty?" The spokesperson adjusted the mic, eyes cool. The officer involved in the incident has been placed on administrative leave. A federal investigation is now underway. Pens scratched across paper keyboards clattered so fast they blurred together. Another voice asked, "Was this racial profiling or security negligence?" He answered, "The Department of Justice will determine that. What we can confirm is that General Ward has chosen not to comment publicly." That final line made the room even louder because the silence of a general can speak louder than any public condemnation. In Burlington, Reed Walker sat alone in his small apartment, the glow of the TV washing over his pale face. The news was broadcasting live, the anchor's voice clear and steady. The Pentagon has officially identified the woman in the viral video as Major General Selene Ward, a decorated officer with 27 years of active service. Reed shot to his feet, the chair crashing back into the wall. The screen's glow lit his face, revealing streaks of sweat across his cheeks. He stepped closer, hands shaken, eyes wide. When the image of Selene at the medal ceremony appeared, it was as if all the blood drained from his body. "General," he whispered, voice as thin as breath. The words landed dry, then vanished into silence. He stepped back and dropped into the chair, his eyes empty. Every word she had said at the cemetery echoed in his mind. "I don't think I command." Now, the line meant something else, no longer defiance, but fact. Reed closed his eyes, his hands clenched tight, veins showing. In his ears, the morning talk show replayed the chants of protesters, the hashtags all merging into one endless noise. He grabbed the remote and turned off the TV, but the sound kept playing in his head. The spokesperson's voice repeating like a verdict, Major General Selene Ward. Outside, news vans lined the front of the Burlington Police Headquarters. Camera lenses, panned microphones aimed at the main door, flash bulbs popping non-stop. A reporter spoke live. "This revelation has sent shockwaves across the nation. What began as a viral video of misconduct has turned into an unprecedented scandal." Behind her, citizens held signs that read, "Respect under the flag." Ambulance sirens wailed in the distance, mixing with the protest chants, creating the loud pulse of a nation burning over a dishonored symbol. Inside the office, Harris stepped in and found Reed sitting motionless, the TV screen now dark. "You saw it?" Harris asked. Reed didn't answer, just nodded slightly, still staring at the blank wall. "She's a General Reed. This isn't going away." Reed let out a dry, bitter laugh. General." I pointed my gun at a general. Harris sat down, eyes heavy, and the whole world saw it. Reed buried his head in his hands, his breathing loud and rough. "They'll ruin me," he said, voice hoarse. "They'll strip my badge, my name." Harris answered slowly, "Habe, but you ruined yourself first." The words pierced the air like a needle, and Reed snapped his head up, eyes wild. "You think I meant to do that?" he shouted. "I thought she was." He stopped, unable to finish because even he couldn't say clearly what he saw in her in that moment. He stood pacing the room, his voice faltering. "She didn't flinch, Harris. She looked at me like she'd seen 1,000 men like me before." Harris looked at him and shook his head. "Maybe she has." The TV turned on again, this time with the national anchor. Her voice rang steady, cold, and formal. "The officer seen in the viral footage is now under federal investigation for misconduct and potential violation of civil rights. Sources confirm the Department of Justice has officially taken over the case." Her final sentence landed like a cold, closing door. Reed let his arms fall to his sides, staring at the screen where the words scrolled across "The officer is now under federal investigation." Outside the window, the evening light reflected off distant buildings, and the sky was streaked in dark orange. In the quiet room, Reed sat alone, both hands covering his face, breath slow and heavy. He didn't know when night had fully fallen, only that the voices still echoed in his mind, hers blended with the anchor's two tones merging into one, Major General Selene Ward. Every time he closed his eyes, the image of the flag returned along with the trembling barrel of his gun. And now, without anyone needing to pass judgment, he already knew the harshest sentence had been delivered the moment that name was spoken aloud to the entire country. That afternoon, the hallway of the Burlington Police Department felt endless fluorescent lights casting patchy reflections on the tile floor. Reed Walker walked past rows of chairs, his shoes echoing with sharp, dry clicks, and every pair of eyes followed him until he turned to look, and they all turned away. The air was heavy, as if everyone in the building was trying to avoid the gaze of the man who had turned their badge into a national disgrace. Familiar faces looked blank. Some nodded politely, some kept their heads down, and others just pressed their lips together in silence. The nameplate on his chest caught the light, flickered, then dimmed like the credibility that had cracked inside his colleagues' minds. The command office door was slightly ajar, and the sharp voice of his superior called out, "Walker inside." He took a long breath and stepped in. Inside, a folded flag hung framed on the wall under it, the words in silver, "To serve with honor." The commander sat behind the desk, face worn, eyes heavy, a thick stack of reports in front of him, and a laptop paused on footage of the incident. He folded his hands silent for a moment that thickened the room with pressure. Finally, he spoke, voice low but heavy enough to make Reed lower his head. "You didn't just break a rule, you broke a flag." The words hit dry and hard, echoing off the four walls. No yelling needed, the weight spoke for itself. Reed opened his mouth, but the excuse caught in his throat. "Sir, it wasn't about the flag," he tried. "I was handling a potential threat." The commander cut him off, eyes cold. "Threat? She's a general. The country trusted you with a gun, and you aimed it at a symbol of the nation. That's not fear, that's failure." He slid a file toward him, the suspension report, the signature still drying. "You're relieved of duty until further notice," he said. "Internal affairs will take over from here." Reed took the paper, his hand slightly trembling, eyes drifting. From the hallway, low voices carried in conversations cut short the moment he stepped out. A young female officer avoided his eyes, her face tense, whispering to the one next to her. "He aimed at a general. What did he expect?" The other replied quietly, "Whatever happens, that badge is done." Reed heard every word, though they thought he hadn't. He walked slowly past the chairs, feeling like he was moving through 2 rows of invisible stairs. At the end of the hall, a large photo of the swearing-in ceremony hung on the wall. The slogan beneath it read, "Protect the law, preserve the dignity." Today, those very words made his throat close up. He stopped at the entrance, clutching the folder tightly, eyes squinting against the sunlight streaming in. The sounds of keyboards, phones, and distant footsteps faded behind him, blending into the hum of exclusion. Reed turned to look down the hallway one last time, where teammates once laughed, once shared victories, and now were silent like a funeral home. The door closed behind him with a heavy creak, marking the moment he understood that isolation didn't come from the public, it came from the place he once called home. Reed stepped out of the command room, a cold draft from the hallway brushing across his shoulders. The room behind him shut, leaving behind a hollow echo in his mind. He walked slowly past the commendation plaques lining the wall, his name still there among those praised for exemplary service. Each word now reads like a quiet mockery. He paused, staring at an old photo from the day he received his medal, smiling brightly in a crisp new uniform. Now that smile felt foreign, like someone else he no longer recognized. A passing officer glanced at him for half a second before turning away quickly, as if avoiding something uncomfortable. Reed pressed his lips together, sighed, forced a faint smile, and muttered, "It's all politics." The words were meant to reassure, but came out thin and strained, echoing down the empty hallway like a joke no one laughed at. He kept walking, each step landing with weight. At the far end, reporters waited outside the main doors, lenses and lights, ready, cameras snapping non-stop. When the doors opened, the crowd surged forward, flashes blinding him. Officer Walker. Any comment? Do you regret your action? Is it true she outranks you? Questions flew like needles. He raised his hand to shield his face, pushed through trying to stay composed, but the barrage of lenses made him feel exposed. Sweat beaded on his skin, and he managed a crooked half-smile, his gaze vacant, his steps slow like a man lost in a crowd. A police car waited at the steps. Another officer held the door open, his eyes uneasy, a mix of pity and distance. As Reed sat down, the windshield reflected the crowd, still snapping photos outside. A large lens caught the moment he looked up. The reflected light illuminated his face, pale, gaunt eyes, sunken, smile, twisted and forced. A reporter pressed the shutter. In that frame, there was no trace of the man who once stood for the law, only the figure of someone fallen away from the very path he once chose. The car door shut with a heavy thud. Reed leaned his head back against the seat, took a long breath, and looked through the tinted glass at the American flag swaying gently atop headquarters. He suddenly recalled the moment he raised his gun at the cemetery. The light, the wind, the woman's face. Everything came back like a slow-motion reel, every detail beating with the rhythm of regret. Outside, flashes still lit up, zooming in on his face, the news ticker running beneath the footage. Former Officer Walker leaves headquarters after disciplinary action. The lens lingered for another second, capturing a close-up of his eyes that no longer held any pride, only the hollow stare of a man who had just lost both his badge and his honor. Night fell over the small street, the glow of street lights casting uneven shadows on the walls, reflecting the image of the American flag flapping hard in the wind. In a third-floor apartment, Reed Walker sat on the sofa, the TV screen casting a pale blue light across his exhausted face. The video of the incident played on every news channel, each frame painfully familiar. He held the remote, his hand slightly trembling, rewinding and pausing at the moment the woman stood beneath the flag. Sunlight in the footage lit up her shoulder, the silver stars on her epaulette glowing her face calm amid the chaos. Major General Selene Ward. The anchor's voice came through low and sharp, the woman who didn't flinch. Reed stared at the image, his eyes blank. He'd watched this part dozens of times, but each viewing cut deeper than the last. Outside, reporters' voices echoed, mixed with the constant clicks of cameras. Officer Walker. Any comment? Do you plan to apologize to General Ward? How do you feel about the federal investigation? The voices overlapped, seeping through the closed windows like waves crashing. He leaned forward, pulled the curtain aside, and looked down at the street. Under the yellow lights, dozens stood waiting, with several news vans parked along both curbs, antennas pointed skyward. From this vantage point, Reed saw the American flag flying on a utility pole at the corner, its shadow flickering on the wall, swaying with each gust of wind. Every time it caught the light, he saw her image again, standing upright, eyes steady, and the words that still echoed in his mind, "You're pointing a gun at a folded flag, not at me." Reed stepped back, pressing his back to the wall, then slid down until he was sitting with his knees drawn up. The room was silent, except for the TV carrying the next news segment. A political analyst spoke. "This isn't just an incident of misconduct. It's a reflection of fear and bias in uniform." The words tightened something in his chest. He turned up the volume, and the anchor's voice rising again. "Public outrage continues to grow nationwide. The officer involved remains under federal investigation." He gave a dry laugh, his voice raspy. "Public outrage. image. They make it sound like war. The laugh faded quickly, swallowed by the stillness of the room. The flickering light from the screen reflected off a mirror on the wall, casting back the image of his pale face. Dark circles beneath his eyes, disheveled hair, wrinkled shirt. He looked 10 years older. On the table, his removed badge still sat there, the metal edges chipped a scratch cutting across the words, "To protect and serve." He stared at it for a long time, as if looking at something that once belonged to him but now felt completely foreign. Outside, the reporters' voices returned closer this time. "Officer Walker, the nation wants to hear from you." That sentence hit him like a blow, and he sprang to his feet, stepping toward the door. His hand touched the doorknob, but stopped. A sudden wave of fear surged up so strong it made his heart pound. He didn't open the door, didn't say a word, just stared at the shadow of the flag through the glass pane. With each gust of wind, the flag shifted, and for a moment he thought he saw Selene's eyes in it, cold, bright, and steady. A shiver ran down his spine. Reed turned away, turned off the TV, and the room sank into darkness. Outside, reporters' voices still echoed, but inside there was only one sound left. The wind whistling through the flags like a reminder that honor never fears, only those who forget it tremble beneath the colors they once swore to protect. Reed sat still on the couch, darkness thickening around the room like heavy fog. Light from outside filtered through the window, casting the shape of the flag swaying on the wall. In that flickering light, his face appeared worn and hollow. He looked down at the floor, where the old badge still lay, its dull metal reflecting faintly like a pair of eyes staring back at him. His hand trembled slightly, hovering over the edge of the table, then froze midair. His voice came out barely audible, dissolving into the silence. She didn't even blink. The words sounded like a confession, soft but drained, dragging behind them the echo of a truth he had tried to avoid. Selene Ward's face rose in his memory, sunlight on her features, her eyes deep and calm like still water. In that moment, he saw more clearly than ever the real source of his fear, not the gun, but the gaze of a woman who had taught him what true power looked like. He bowed his head, took a deep breath. The lingering smell of smoke mixed with damp wood weighed heavily in his chest. Each heartbeat echoed like a funeral drum. The memories came in slow motion. The blistering noon heat wind tearing through the flags, the sound of the bugle cutting through the silence, her unwavering eyes even with a gun pointed at her. He remembered how the light hit her silver stars, how she spoke each word short and slow, but enough to stop everyone around from breathing. His whole body tensed, regret crawling through his chest, quiet but sharp like a blade slicing through the last of his pride. The TV turned back on behind him, a blue light spreading across the room. The anchor's voice returned steady and firm, "General Ward to appear before the Senate hearing tomorrow." The words startled him, and he turned toward the screen. Selene appeared in full uniform, walking through the halls of Congress, surrounded by reporters. Camera flashes burst around her, her face lit up among the crowd. Every step she took echoed off the floor loud as a drumbeat of judgment. Reed stared, lips dry, his hand tightening around the remote, eyes locked on the screen. All other sounds faded, leaving only the cold voice of the anchor. Tomorrow's hearing will address the broader issue of systemic prejudice within law enforcement. Reed leaned back in his chair, eyes still fixed on the image. She appeared before Congress carrying the calm of someone who had been through war, while he, the man who once stood at a funeral, had now become the textbook example of a failure in discipline. The wind outside kept blowing, making the flag tap softly against the pole, its sound mixing with the TV's, forming the rhythm of a night that had yet to end. He turned off the screen, and the room sank into darkness. Everything around him was so still that he could hear his own heartbeat. In his mind, the image of Selene Ward remained, her every step blending with the sound of the wind like a reminder that honor doesn't always have to shout, it just stands there, calm and radiant, making those who once dismissed it lower their heads in silence. The congressional hearing room blazed with lights, hundreds of television lenses aimed at the same spot. Cameras rolled steadily, chairs shifted quietly, and the large chamber seemed to hold its breath. When the door opened, every whisper fell silent. Selene Ward entered upright and measured white lights catching the silver on her epaulettes, making the stars on her insignia glint. Camera shutters clicked in rapid succession, flash bulbs casting a cold halo across her face. She paused at the podium, eyes sweeping the rows of lawmakers. Those who had followed the incident on screen now faced the person at its center. Behind them, journalists bent over notebooks, the sound of pens on paper mixing with steady breaths, forming an atmosphere tense but dignified. The committee chair rose, his voice low and clear through the microphone. "General Ward, thank you for being here. The country's been watching closely. One question has been asked over and over. Why didn't you reveal your rank during the incident?" The question landed echoing through the hall before falling into a long silence. Selene looked directly at the podium, her eyes calm, unmoved. She placed both hands on the table, bowed her head slightly, and spoke in a voice low but firm. "Because my rank was never the point. Respect shouldn't depend on medals or stars. It should exist before authority ever arrives." A small ripple moved through the room, and some lawmakers nodded. Others leaned in to take notes. The chair lowered his gaze, speaking more gently. "You mean you wanted to be treated as a citizen first, not as a general?" Selene nodded slightly. "Exactly. That day, I stood there not as a superior officer, but as a witness of what fear looks like when it wears a uniform." Her words cut through the silence like a blade, shifting the room's stillness. A reporter near the back whispered, "That's going to be tomorrow's headline." A camera zoomed in on her face, light reflected in her eyes like still water. A young lawmaker followed up, "General Ward, were you angry when he pointed the gun?" She lowered her head slightly, lips curling into a faint, dry smile. "No, I was disappointed, because a gun drawn at a funeral isn't just an act of aggression, it's a confession of fear." The sound echoed in the room, hands paused, chairs shifted faintly. That answer wasn't only for the question, but for everyone watching live on national television. On the large screen behind her, the funeral scene appeared once again. Selene and the officer, the flag flying, the crowd standing still. The chairman's voice rose again. "What do you hope this country learns from what happened?" Selene took a soft breath, looked up at her own image, reflected on the screen, and answered firmly that respect cannot be demanded with a gun and dignity cannot be taken by fear. The chamber fell into frozen silence. Then soft applause began, scattered at first, then spreading across the rows. The camera panned to her face, her eyes still bright under the lights, not proud, not defiant, only calm and sincere. As the hearing ended, the chairman bowed his head slightly, speaking quietly into the microphone. "Thank you for reminding us what honor truly means." Applause broke out again, stronger, more unified. Outside the hearing room, hundreds of citizens waited, watching on the large screen, many wiping away tears as Selene stepped out. The flag reflected on her shoulder light from the Capitol dome, casting down, turning that moment into a symbol of truth and honor. That afternoon, America didn't just hear a testimony. It witnessed the reaffirmation of respect, something a general had defended not through power, but through stillness in the face of a weapon. Selene paused before the next question, her gaze moving to the rows of spectators, where lawmakers, journalists, and a live television audience waited silently for her reply. As the chairman's voice faded, the room fell quiet. Only the slow whir of cameras and steady scratching of pens audible in the far corner. She inhaled softly, her voice rising clear and steady. "Because the uniform shouldn't determine respect, humanity should. The words rang out like a strike on the metal, echoing off thick wood-paneled walls and settling over every person in the room. No one clapped, no one spoke. Everyone sat still, realizing what they had just heard wasn't a defense, but a truth so simple it hurt. The camera slowly zoomed in on her face, capturing an unflinching gaze, calm and radiant in the spotlight. Some lawmakers lowered their heads. Others wrote her words down exactly. A few leaned back in their chairs, eyes fixed on the large screen behind her, where the English subtitles replayed each word. Because the uniform shouldn't determine respect, humanity should. In the press row, a female reporter whispered, "That's the headline," and her fingers tapped quickly over the keyboard, sending the first alert to her newsroom. Within minutes, the front pages of major news sites flashed with the same headline, "General Selene Ward, Humanity Before Uniform." The hearing room seemed to change color, the overhead lights casting a glow on Selene's face, setting her apart from the crowd. No one spoke, but everyone felt the weight of her words. The chairman set his pen down, looked up at her, and gave a slight nod. He said softly, "General Ward, those words might outlive this hearing." Selene didn't respond, only bowed her head slightly, her eyes blinking as if looking past every lens to reach those watching on the outside. Inside, broadcast studios across the country, newsrooms scrambled to rebuild, the evening coverage editors cutting footage and replaying that single line at the top of every show. Political analysts on air unanimously agreed that the statement had touched the nation's conscience. One commentator said, "We've heard thousands of speeches about honor, but just one sentence made people reflect on how they see others." In the Capitol hallway, reporters jostled for position microphones, raised all trying to capture the moment she stepped out. When the wooden doors opened, sunlight poured in, making the silver insignia on her shoulder gleam. The waiting crowd outside erupted the moment they saw her. An older woman in the front row leaned down and whispered to her daughter, "That's the kind of strength this country needs." The cheers rose alongside the fluttering flag on the Capitol dome, a simple image that recalled the funeral where it all began. That night, during the nation's primetime broadcast, her words opened the news with a strong, clear voice, then repeated over footage of the flag and Selene Ward's face. International outlets quoted it, and major newspapers printed it on the front page. In the glow of millions of screens, what she meant became unmistakable, that honor does not lie in cloth or rank, but in how people choose to treat each other. The night in the police disciplinary office was eerily quiet, the pale fluorescent lights casting a bluish glow on the ceiling, reflecting down onto the thick wooden desk where Reed Walker sat, head bowed. The scent of stale coffee, cigarettes, and printed paper mixed together, heavy enough to suggest how long fatigue had clung to the walls. In front of him was a statement form marked in bold internal affairs. Statement on incident. His pen moved slowly, the scrawled handwriting pausing at the line, weapon drawn for safety. Reed stopped staring at the words he'd just written, then looked up, eyes vacant. The investigator across from him said nothing, just observed through black-rimmed glasses, eyes deep and cold. The air between them felt dense, as if even a breath could tilt the room. "Is that your final statement?" the investigator asked, voice low, steady, emotionless. Reed gave a slight nod, his voice hoarse. "Yes, I followed protocol." The other man raised an eyebrow, flipping the file back open, his finger stopping at the line noting the incident timestamp. "You said you followed protocol. Then why does the recording stop 30 seconds before you drew your gun?" Reed froze, a twitch flickering across his eyelid. "It malfunctioned. It happens sometimes." The investigator showed no reaction, just stood and slowly walked over to the projector already running. A press of a button and footage from Reed's own body cam appeared. The image trembled slightly, catching harsh sunlight, the sound of a funeral bugle, solemn faces, then it abruptly went black. The glow from the screen lit up Reed's face, highlighting the sweat tracing down his temple. The investigator turned back, hands in his pockets, gaze fixed. Malfunction doesn't come with fingerprints. The words drained the color from Reed's face. He lowered his head, lips pressed tight, fists clenched. The folder on the table had fallen open, revealing printed stills, images of his hand pressing the button on his shoulder precisely when the body cam stopped recording. "You manually disabled it," the investigator said, voice heavier now, "and you did it right before drawing your gun." Reed tried to form a reply, but his throat locked up. "I didn't mean to. It was instinct." The words came out weak, stripped of weight. The investigator leaned slightly forward, speaking slowly. "Instinct doesn't delete evidence, officer." A long silence followed, broken only by the ticking of the clock. Reed looked around the room, his eyes lost. He knew he was cornered, every layer of justification unraveling one by one. "You understand what this means, right?" The investigator continued. "Disabling a body cam is automatic misconduct. It's obstruction, not protocol." Reed closed his eyes, a bead of sweat falling onto the form, smearing the ink into a faint blur. "I was under pressure," he whispered. "I didn't want things to look worse than they were." The other man inhaled sharply, his voice like a blade. "They look worse now." He gathered the files, turned off the projector, and the room's light dimmed. "You'll be notified in writing," he said calmly, "but I suggest you prepare for an official hearing." Reed stayed still, head bowed, sunken eyes fixed on the badge lying on the table, where the light reflected off it in a faint streak like a river flowing through darkness. As the investigator walked out and the door closed behind him, Reed was left alone with a stack of ink-blurred papers and a recording cut in half. The hum of the air conditioning returned cold and monotonous, like the ticking of a clock counting down the seconds until the full truth surfaced, slicing away what was left of a statement already stripped of value. Reed kept his head down, peers interlocked the screen's glow, casting his face in the most exhausted light he had ever worn. When the investigator replayed the footage, the scene cut out abruptly after a few seconds. Reed blinked rapidly and spoke, his voice unsteady. It glitched. The words came out fast, more reflex than justification. The investigator straightened to gaze, steady. "You're saying the device malfunctioned?" Reed nodded slightly, trying to keep his tone level. "It happens, sir. These models freeze up sometimes. It wasn't intentional." The man paused for a moment, then smiled slightly, not kindly, but with the weariness of someone who'd heard every excuse. "We've tested it," he said slowly. "There's no glitch. You press the button." The statement hit hard. Reed froze, eyes locked on the table as if searching for a crack small enough to crawl into. The air turned thick, heavy like smoke with no way out. The investigator closed the file, his voice even and cold. "You'll hear from us soon. I'd recommend not giving interviews." Risha didn't respond, sitting motionless until the door clicked shut and the hinge echoed dryly through the hallway. He leaned back in the chair, exhaled sharply, and stared at the ceiling, lips barely moving as he repeated the words he'd just said. It glitched. The phrase sounded hollow, like something even he didn't believe. He rubbed his face, heat rising through his skin, a mix of shame and panic. In that moment, he realized the truth no longer belonged to him, but to the hard drive inside that camera where every lie could be exposed by a single technical report. The next morning, the sun rose, but the light outside felt colder than usual. In cafes, train stations, and offices, the same news report played. The anchor woman's voice was steady, each word like a pinned body cam. Intentionally disabled internal affairs confirms misconduct. Reed's face appeared on screen, expression grim with the subtitle flashing beside him. Officer admits footage, failure under investigation. People paused mid-breakfast, watching the screen before slowly shaking their heads. A group at a diner near the police station murmured, "He said it glitched. That's the oldest lie in the book." The comment was cut by a ringing phone, the clink of coffee cups, then folded back into the endless current of headlines. At the local news station's press room, the footage replayed every hour each time, zooming in on the moment the body cam shut off, followed by a technical diagram proving manual input. On social media, the backlash exploded. Thousands shared the video with captions dripping in sarcasm. The camera didn't glitch. The conscience did. Every angle now pointed at him. No one believing in technical errors anymore. No one defending a coincidence. Reed sat in his small apartment. TV lit his reflection mirrored on the screen beneath the scrolling headline. His eyes hollow, not angry anymore, only tired. The anchor's voice ended the morning news with a final even tone. The investigation continues as the public demands accountability. In that moment, Reed understood there was no malfunction greater than losing the trust of an entire nation, and no sound louder than the two words he had just spoken. It glitched. The morning at the National Cemetery was so still that one could hear the wind moving through the rows of flags. The dawn light spread across the dew-covered grass in a pale, cold yellow. Selene Ward walked slowly among the white headstones holding a single white rose, its soft petals trembling in the early breeze. In front of her stood the grave of an old comrade, one who had fallen during an operation long ago. She knelt, placing the flower on the still damp earth, her hand pausing on the edge of the stone, fingers brushing the faded inscription for those who stood their ground. The light hit her silver insignia, casting her shadow long over the granite, as quiet as the silence within her. There were no cameras now, no public noise, only her, the flag, and the memory of those who were gone. A small group of reporters approached from a distance, their voices low at first, then rising as they drew nearer. They carried microphones, cameras, eyes filled with both curiosity and hesitation. One of them broke the quiet. General Ward, do you forgive him? The question floated into the air, echoing faintly between the gravestones like a misplaced sound. Selene stood tall, the wind catching the hem of her uniform, her gaze turning toward the reporter. For a few seconds no one spoke, only the soft click of a camera capturing the moment the nation had been waiting for. She looked at them without anger, without avoidance, only a strange calm. Forgiveness. She repeated, her voice low and warm, as if speaking to herself. She turned back to the headstone where the engraved words stood like a reminder carved by time. Forgiveness isn't mercy, she said softly. It's discipline. Every sound fell away. The reporter lowered the mic, and the rest stood still, not daring to exhale too loudly. The answer was brief, but enough to make clear that her grace was not weakness, but the strength of someone who places honor above emotion. Selene bowed her head once more, her hand resting gently on the grave, her face tilted in the morning light. He will live with what he's done, she said slowly, and that's punishment enough. The words drifted into the wind light as dew, but carried far in the hearts of those present. A young reporter lowered his camera, glanced at a colleague, his eyes tinged with sadness. They understood not everyone could say such words after everything that had happened. The wind rose again, carrying a few rose petals from the stem, rolling gently across the grass before settling between two headstones. Selene stood there a while longer, gazing at the rows of graves stretching to the horizon. Her shadow merged with the fluttering flags, blending into the morning light. When she turned to leave, her footsteps echoed evenly, each stride firm. Behind her, the older reporter spoke softly, almost a whisper. She didn't need to forgive. She just reminded us what dignity sounds like. And as Selene disappeared from view, the sunlight hit the headstone, reflecting the small inscription below, silence under the flag. A silence not of forgetting, but the sharpest answer a general could give to a world loudly chasing justice. The early sun filtered through the trees, casting light on the white headstone, making the engraved words shimmer as if alive. Selene Ward remained still, the breeze brushing the edge of her uniform, rustling the red ribbon on the wreath at her feet. When the reporter repeated the question, his voice trembled slightly in the wide open space. General, do you forgive him? Selene tilted her head slightly, her eyes fixed on the stone before her where the name of an old comrade was etched. She breathed gently, then replied, forgiveness isn't mercy, it's discipline. The words didn't carry far, but they spread on the wind, passing through the flags and blending with the morning birdsong. Everyone nearby went silent. For a few seconds it seemed all understood. Her forgiveness forgiveness did not come from pity, but from a discipline of the soul where one must learn to stand through pain instead of being broken by it. The young reporter gripped his microphone, emotion clear on his face. He turned to a colleague, voice low. She just said what the world's forgotten. Selene's words were sent to the newsroom immediately, where reporters at the cemetery gate began writing. The headline appeared soon after, "Forgiveness isn't mercy, it's discipline." News networks replayed the moment, her voice layered over soft music framed by the image of the American flag waving against the blue sky. Viewers across the country felt the weight of that line not as a declaration but as the distilled truth of a life that had seen too much loss, where grace was forged by discipline, not handed out. That afternoon, people returned to the cemetery. A group of veterans and military cadets erected a small memorial near the gravesite, a black stone plaque etched with silver letters, "Silence under the flag." Just below it was her quote, simple and proud, "Forgiveness isn't mercy, it's discipline." When sunlight hit directly, each word shimmered like metal as if forged in the heat of justice itself. Many paused, heads bowed. No one spoke. Some took photos of the plaque, others simply laid a hand on it, feeling the cold stone carry a quiet sense of respect. Selene left in silence, her shadow stretching long across the ground. Behind her, the wind still moved through the rows of flags, sounding like the echo of an old anthem, not played by instruments this time, but breathed by those learning how to honor. That plaque became a stop for soldiers, students, and even civilians who had never worn a uniform, but wanted to understand what true strength of compassion looked like. And from that day on, whenever the wind passed through the cemetery, people heard the soft sound of flags brushing together like a whisper, repeating the general's word. Forgiveness isn't mercy, it's the discipline of the heart. On the morning of the trial, the atmosphere outside the federal courthouse was packed with people. The line stretched from the steps all the way to the iron fence, hands holding flags, signs, and photos of Selene Ward. Sunlight hit the giant white banner reading "Respect under the flag," the wind whipping it like a wave, creating a sound like crashing surf. On the stone steps, veterans in old uniforms stood at attention, eyes fixed on the large wooden doors where the hearing was about to begin. Reporters jostled for position lenses, scanning every face, every slogan, every chant of apologize to the general rising above the police sirens. Inside, the white ceiling lights reflected off the polished wood-paneled walls where journalists had already filled the back rows. Reed Walker entered, gripping a folder tightly, his posture stiff. As he appeared in the hallway, a group stood and shouted, "Apologize to the general, show some respect." He lowered his head, avoiding the stairs, quickening his pace. Light from the far-end windows hit his face, directly revealing exhaustion and disarray. Outside, the chanting still echoed, a relentless tide crashing against the courthouse walls. In the courtroom, Reed sat at the defendant's table, his eyes swollen from sleepless nights, while his attorney, a salt-and-pepper-haired man, rose to begin the defense. When the judge struck the gavel, the room fell silent. The attorney spoke slowly and clearly. "Your Honor, my client's actions were not born from hate or arrogance. It was a mistake, a reaction made under pressure." He paused, glancing around to gauge the crowd's response. In the front row, some whispered, some shook their heads. Selene Ward, seated across the aisle, remained calm and expressionless. Her arms were crossed, her posture upright, her face lit by the ceiling lights. The attorney continued louder now. He didn't know who she was. He didn't realize the circumstances. Fear took control. "Haven't we all made mistakes under fear?" The words rang out, but the only response was heavy silence. The judge leaned back, his eyes cold and resolute. He replied, "Fear doesn't excuse misconduct. Fear reveals character." A ripple moved through the courtroom. A few Their heads nodded, soft murmurs of agreement followed. Reed inhaled deeply, his hands clenched so tightly his knuckles turned white. He looked down, eyes fixed on the gleaming wooden floor where his shadow stretched long and dark. Selene looked up on her gaze locking onto his. There was no anger, no pity, only the steadiness of someone who had accepted everything. Light from the window reflected off the silver stars on her shoulder, making the courtroom seem brighter. Reed saw those eyes, the same ones he had avoided at the cemetery that morning, now staring straight at him in court, cold, yet carrying something that made his chest feel heavy. His lawyer leaned over and whispered, "Keep your head up, Reed." He didn't answer, just shook his head slightly because he knew the only thing left to lift now wasn't honor, but the sentence waiting ahead. When the judge called for a recess, the crowd outside still hadn't left. The chant, "Apologize to the general," rang out again, louder, steadier, like a drum pounding with the heartbeat of someone standing between justice and judgment. Reed paused at the door, staring into the blinding light beyond, and in that moment he realized this wasn't just a trial by law, it was a reckoning by a nation reclaiming the respect that had been aimed at with a gun. The wooden doors at the back of the courtroom swung open, and every whisper fell silent. Selene Ward entered light from the hallway, striking her silver shoulders, and the room seemed to hold its breath. She walked calmly past the rows of seats, her posture upright and composed, each step echoing against the cold stone floor. As she neared the witness stand, all eyes followed her. A few reporters leaned in for quick shots, shutters clicking between gasps. Selene didn't look toward the defendant, but Reed felt her presence before he turned his head. She placed her hand on the wooden stand, her voice calm and firm. "A mistake made with arrogance isn't a mistake, it's intent." The words dropped into the air like a verdict already carved. No one reacted, but everyone understood that those words alone rendered every defense meaningless. The judge looked up at her, his expression both respectful and cautious. Selene continued her tone, steady, not bitter, not soft. "This isn't about one man and one action. It's about what happens when power forgets humility." Light from the window outlined her face, sharp and bright. The courtroom watched her. Some bowed their heads. A few wiped away tears because in those words they heard something greater than a case. It was a warning for anyone who ever thought honor was something granted, not something kept. Reed sat still, hands clasped tightly, head bowed. He heard every word, every pause, each syllable, hidden the deepest part of his conscience. He had once been used to giving orders, used to being right by default, but now the woman he once pointed a gun at was standing in court, speaking of the arrogance he had worn like a second skin. A mistake made with arrogance. The phrase repeated in his head, tightening his throat. He looked up for the first time, daring to face her eyes, wet and sunken, but Selene didn't meet his gaze. The judge tapped the gavel lightly against the desk, his voice steady. "The court has heard enough." The courtroom fell completely silent. The clicking of cameras ceased and every eye turned toward the bench. He read the verdict in a low, deliberate tone. "Officer Reed Walker, this court sentences you to a suspended sentence under federal misconduct. Your badge is revoked, your record permanently marked." The gavel came down one final time, the sound loud and dry like the closing of a long chapter. Reed lowered his head, hands loosened, and with each strike of the gavel he felt as if parts of himself were falling away. Selene gave the judge a slight nod, then turned and walked out of the courtroom. She passed the rows of reporters where camera flashes burst again, capturing her figure against the stark white light. A young reporter whispered, "That wasn't a verdict. That was history speaking." Outside, the crowd was still waiting, their chants echoing back through the courthouse walls. Respect under the flag. Selene stepped out to the afternoon light casting over her shoulders, the wind passing gently through the rows of flags. In that moment, the verdict had been delivered not just for one man, but for an entire era that had forgotten power is never greater than dignity. That afternoon, the capital's central square was filled with people. Thousands of small flags fluttered in the hands of those attending the ceremony, sunlight shining through red, white, and blue ribbons draped around the memorial stage. On the main platform, the military band played a slow march, the sound echoing steadily through the open air. At the center of the stage stood a large stone engraved in silver letters, in honor of those who served with dignity. Today's ceremony was not only to honor fallen soldiers but also to mend the wound to the dignity that the entire nation had witnessed. Reed Walker stood under the glare of dozens of cameras wearing a dark suit, his face thinner, his eyes sunken. When the host invited him to step forward, the crowd fell completely silent. Wind swept through the flags behind him, painting bold strokes of color across the sky. He held the microphone, his hand trembling slightly, voice caught in his throat. "I failed my badge." The sound was hoarse and fragile, drifting out and fading quickly into silence. He bowed his head, eyes downcast, the next words softer but true. "I forgot that respect is heavier than pride." The square remained quiet. No applause, no cheers, only the sound of wind and the faint clicking of cameras. Selene Ward stood in the front row, her expression calm, eyes fixed on the stage. As Reed lowered the mic, she stepped forward, the sound of her shoes faint against the stone steps. She stopped before him, light casting across her shoulder, making the silver stars on her epaulette glint. She looked at him for a long moment, and in that gaze was no anger, only the stillness of someone who had accepted what needed to happen. Her voice was steady and low, then earn it back in silence. The words were soft, but they carried through the entire square, reaching even those in the farthest rows. Reed looked up, eyes filled with emotion, but said nothing, only nodded slowly. Selene turned to the crowd and raised her hand in a formal salute. The soldiers in formation immediately returned the gesture, and thousands bowed their heads, ribbons lifting in the breeze like waves. A moment of silence was observed, the funeral trumpet sounding low, drawn out, and still. In that moment, no one spoke, no one clapped. They simply stood, letting silence speak for them. When the music ended, Selene placed a white rose on the memorial stone. Reed stepped back, eyes following her. She turned to look at him one last time, and in her gaze there was no distance between winner and loser, only a recognition between two people standing beneath the same flag, where honor is not measured by applause, but by the ability to face oneself. The wind blew stronger, carrying dust and light into a swirl. The entire square was bathed in a fiery red sunset, as if to say that justice needs no praise, only the humility to bow before what truly matters. The trumpet sounded across the square, slow and solemn, a blend of brass and breath spreading through the open space. Everyone bowed their heads, thousands of people unified as one. In that moment, the noise of media, social networks, and outside debates faded completely. Elderly soldiers placed their hands over their heart. Young cadets stood at attention, and ordinary citizens held absolute silence. The sound of the funeral trumpet carved out a stillness in the air, a space where people faced their own hearts. Selene Ward stood among the flags, the slanting afternoon light touching her shoulder, her black hair gently stirred by the wind. She closed her eyes, each note brushing against her chest, every melody farewell, a reminder that true honor doesn't need to be named, only upheld. Reed Walker stood a few steps away, head bowed, his hand gripping the edge of his coat, a feeling rising inside him, part emptiness, part peace. Each note was a new breath, a way to release the weight lingering in his mind. He saw Selene standing upright, still as the flag behind her, the surrounding light making her blend into the symbol the nation was looking toward. In that moment, he understood why people called her a symbol of honor, not because of her rank, but because of her calm when others trembled in the face of wrongdoing. As the final note faded, a sudden gust swept through the square, lifting the red ribbons into the air, wrapping around the tallest flagpole. People looked up. In the sunset light, the red ribbon twined around the American flag, fluttering above, creating a radiant, sacred image. The last sunlight reflected off the fabric, making the red glow like fire. Selene turned, stepping slowly down the stone steps, her shoes making soft, steady sounds. She passed a row of solemn soldiers, each raising a salute, their eyes following her, until her figure blended into the field of waving flags. A small child in the crowd tugged on his father's hand and asked quietly, "Dad, who is she?" The man replied, voice low and warm, "Someone who reminded us what respect means." The answer faded into the wind, yet seemed to spread everywhere. On stage, the host paused for a few seconds, then spoke softly into the microphone. Let the flag speak for her. At that moment, no more words were needed because everyone was already looking in the same direction. Selene walked on behind her, the red ribbon still wrapped around the flag like the arms of justice, gleaming in the final light of day. That image would remain in the minds of millions, an ending that needed no applause, only a nation's silent bow before the calm of honor and the strength of compassion. A year later, autumn returned with a crisp, chill yellow leaves scattered across the central square of the capital. At the National Military Museum, the opening of the Honor and Humanity exhibition drew hundreds of guests from veterans to young cadets of the Defense Academy. The main hall glowed with warm light, high ceilings, and glass walls reflecting the flags flying outside. In the solemn space, a massive screen stood at the center, white letters appearing on a black background, uncut footage. Military Funeral, Arlington. When the text faded, the first frame appeared a flag-draped casket, wind sweeping past the headstones, and the image of a woman facing a police officer in the fateful midday sun. A soft murmur rose, then faded as silence settled over the room. There was no commentary, no cuts, just the scene played in full, a slice of time preserved. The camera moved slowly, capturing Selene Ward standing before the drawn gun, sunlight glinting off her silver shoulder bars, her eyes steady while the wind stirred dust around the flag. Her voice rang deep and clear. "You're pointing a gun at a folded flag, not at me." The sound filled the hall, freezing the audience. An elderly veteran clenched his fist, eyes reddened. A young cadet beside him placed a hand over his heart, eyes fixed on the screen as if witnessing something sacred. As the video reached its peak, with Reed drawing his weapon, the room was so silent that one could hear the heartbeat of the person next to them. Then, when Selene said, "I don't think I command," a few bowed their heads and some closed their eyes. The video ended with her walking away to the sound of a funeral bugle, white light spreading across her shoulder, the final frame stopping as the flag filled half the screen. No background music, no effects, just light and truth. The lights came back on, and for a few seconds no one spoke. A middle-aged woman in the front row wiped away tears, her voice breaking. It's like watching courage breathe. Across the room, a group of students stood silently, their faces solemn as if they'd just left a real memorial. The museum director stepped onto the podium, his voice steady. "This footage remains uncut to remind us that dignity doesn't need editing." His words drew nods, eyes glistening. Selene Ward was present that day, but she stood in the last row apart from the crowd. The light from the screen still reflected on her face, making her eyes deeper and quieter. She said nothing, only looked at the image of herself in the video, the woman who had once stood in sunlight in the wind under the gaze of the world. When the clip ended, she turned away, walking slowly toward the long hallway that led outside. Outside the museum, the autumn wind blew gently, spinning fallen leaves around her feet. And in that moment, silence became the strongest voice, the story of courage, of dignity, and of a general who chose to let justice speak through uncut footage. At the end of the video, the screen faded to black, then showed a simple line of white text, "Respect is the highest command." No effects, no music, only silence filling the room, making each word feel carved into the air. The light from the room reflected on the faces of those watching, and everyone was still. Some bit their lips, some nodded gently, while elderly veterans slowly stood saluting with absolute solemnity. That line, simple but piercing, felt like an order above all protocol, all rank, a command that needed no shouting but lived in action in the way people looked at one another with respect. The glow of those words cast softly onto the wall, spreading like morning sunlight, warming the room, as if each letter carried the breath of humanity. Selene Ward stood at the very back among rows of moved onlookers. The light reflected off the silver bars on her shoulders, highlighting faint scratches that time hadn't yet erased. She did not step forward, nor did she leave. She simply stood, hands gently clasped, eyes fixed on that line of text. In those eyes, one could see the weariness of someone who had walked through storms, but also the calm of someone who chose to release anger to hold on to something greater dignity. A young journalist recognized her, raised his camera to take a picture, then slowly lowered it, realizing this moment did not need to be captured. It only needed to be witnessed. Wind from the hallway outside slipped through the door, making the curtain behind Selene gently sway. The large photo of the funeral from years ago hung on the wall across from her, the flag in the picture still flying as if time had never passed. She looked at it for a long while, the corner of her mouth lifting in a faint smile, light as a greeting to the past. In her mind, the sound of the old funeral bugle returned the wind, and the voices shouting respect under the flag outside the courthouse all blending into one distant stream of sound. Now, standing in the place that honored the values she once defended, Selene felt that everything had come full circle. A young schoolgirl stepped forward, tugged her mother's hand, and whispered, "Mom, what does it mean?" The mother leaned down, looked at the words on the screen, and softly replied, "It means respect is the real power." The answer rang just loud enough for a few nearby to hear, and they all smiled. Selene turned to look at them. Her gaze softened, the light on her face making her expression both gentle and steady. As the text faded, the lights in the room dimmed, leaving behind complete silence. She turned and walked toward the door, her silhouette blending into the light outside. Behind her, the final words still glimmered faintly on the screen. Respect is the highest command. It stayed there like a message from history to all who hold power in their hands, that honor does not come from a badge, but from the way a person chooses to stand upright for what is right. That afternoon, Selene Ward's office was filled with a pale golden light from the large window. Outside, the late sun filtered through the leaves, casting long patterns on the wall, while inside, everything was so quiet she could hear the soft glide of a pen across paper. On the desk, a cream-colored envelope lay, neatly the handwriting in slanted blue ink read, "To General Ward." Selene picked up the letter and recognized the shaky script of an older person, each stroke firm but full of emotion. She opened it, the scent of old paper mixing with fading ink in the air. Inside were a few short lines, not formal, not defensive, just words from a mother to the woman who once stood before her son in a defining moment. "I raised him to salute, not to shame." The letter read with the word "salute" underlined like an effort to hold on to some last thread of dignity. Beneath it, the mother had written, "I don't ask you to forgive him, but please remember he wasn't born cruel. The world taught him to be afraid." Selene sat for a long time, her eyes fixed on the paper. The brief message stirred something hard to name, part sorrow, part understanding. She looked out the window where the flag was gently waving atop the building. Her hand rested on the page as if holding on to a piece of memory from a mother she had never met. A woman who had lost the image of a son she once felt proud of, yet still had the strength to write one final thing, believing that forgiveness was needed on both sides. In the quiet room, Selene pulled out another sheet, picked up her pen, and wrote slowly, each stroke steady and soft. "Mothers build soldiers, systems break them." The reply was simple, but it reflected everything she had seen, that a person's mistake is sometimes the result of a machine that has forgotten how to be human. She paused, looking at the line she had written, her gaze softening. She thought of her years in the military, of the young faces once taught how to fight, but rarely how to stand up after falling. The system trains the hand, but not the heart, she said quietly, her voice blending with the steady hum of the fan. A young officer stepped in, stopping at the doorway, and she motioned that no words were needed. She placed the two letters side by side, the mother's and her own two fragile pieces of paper, carrying the full weight of a lesson in humanity and honor. As dusk settled in, Selene folded her letter, placed it in a new envelope, sealed it, and wrote the address in black ink. Before sending it, she looked at it once more, her hand brushing over the first line. Outside, the reflection of the national flag cast a soft red glow across the desk. She whispered to herself, if fear built walls, then understanding must break them. Then she stood and walked out into the long hallway, her footsteps slow and steady, blending into the fading light of day. A day closing with two letters, one sent from pain, one returned with grace, so both could rest in truth. The next morning, the front courtyard of the Military Institute was bathed in slanted sunlight, wind rustling through the old trees as leaves drifted gently onto the pale stone path. Selene Ward stepped out of the building holding a folder, her stride calm and steady, light catching her silver epaulets so that each step seemed to draw a narrow line of brightness. At the far end of the hallway, a figure stood waiting, an older woman with neatly tied silver hair clutching a worn canvas bag. It was Reed's mother. She had arrived early, quietly standing by the wall where the national flag hung. As Selene approached, the woman turned her eyes kind but deep, holding more than words could carry. The two women, one who had lost her son in shame, one who had once faced his gun, stood facing each other in the gentle light. No words were spoken, no awkwardness lingered, just a long silence in which time seemed to pause. Selene stopped in front of her, her face unreadable, her gaze calm but searching. The mother looked at her for a long time, then gave a slight nod. It was so subtle one might mistake it for a breath, but in that moment, all bitterness, all hurt, all invisible distance quietly dissolved. Selene returned the nod with one of her own, saying nothing more. They stood still, only the wind moving through, carrying the scent of fresh grass and the sound of rustling leaves. A group of young cadets passed by, paused at the sight, bowed respectfully, then moved on, their eyes reflecting a reverence that needed no instruction. The morning light tilted through the window pane, shining directly onto the large flag hung on the wall behind them. The red of the flag reflected on the stone floor, vivid but warm like a flame threading its way through the stillness. Both women looked toward it, exhaling slowly at the same time without meaning to. That light wrapped around them, blending into memories, mistakes, and the wounds that had once torn through honor, now seemingly mended by silence. Selene gently touched the edge of a nearby table where a frame held photos of fallen soldiers, her voice low and measured. He served the flag once. That should be remembered. The mother said nothing, just placed her hand over her chest, her eyes quietly fixed on the flag, waving gently in the breeze. A final ray of light filtered in through the glass, lighting her face and softening the lines around her eyes. The second nod came then, quiet enough to close a long story without needing a single word. Selene turned and walked slowly down the hallway, her figure fading into the long shaft of sunlight stretching across the stone floor. The mother remained where she was, watching, her gaze no longer heavy. Behind them, the flag continued to fly, light reflecting off each fold, so the red, white, and blue blended into one. Like a symbol of a simple truth, honor is not born from power, but from the moment people fall silent long enough to truly understand one another. On a winter morning, sunlight streamed through the tall windows, casting reflections on the blackboard in the police academy lecture hall. Long rows of desks were neatly arranged, and the young, attentive faces turned toward the glowing screen. On it, The video that once shook the nation played again the moment a woman in uniform stood in a cemetery facing a trembling gun. The low sound of a funeral bugle came through the speakers, blended with the wind, creating an atmosphere so heavy that the room fell into absolute silence. The light from the screen caught the frame where Selene Ward raised her head, her eyes calm, her voice firm. "You're pointing a gun at a folded flag, not at me." No one breathed heavily. Every gaze was locked on the image as if witnessing a sacred moment in history. The instructor stood at the front, her voice low and steady. This was not just an incident. It was a moment when a nation was forced to look in the mirror. She turned off the lights, leaving the glow of the screen to illuminate the cadets' faces. They remained silent, their eyes a mix of curiosity and emotion. In the middle row, a young cadet raised his hand and asked softly, "Ma'am, was she afraid?" The question floated like air, yet it froze the room. The instructor smiled faintly, walked toward the front row, placed the chalk down and answered slowly, "If she were, it made her stronger. Courage isn't the absence of fear. It's choosing duty despite it." Her voice was even, each word falling deeply into the hearts of her listeners. No one took notes because these words were not meant to be written, but remembered. She turned back to the screen and played the final part of the video where Selena walked away to the sound of the bugle light reflecting off her silver epaulets. She didn't raise her voice. The instructor continued. She raised the standard. Another cadet spoke up, voice firm. "She made us look small that day." The instructor nodded, her gaze kind but resolute. "No, son, she made us remember how to stand tall." The rows fell silent once more, and in that moment it was no longer just a lecture, it became an unspoken ceremony, where each person began to understand the true meaning of honor. As the video ended, the final words appeared on the screen. "Respect is the highest command." The entire hall rose to its feet at the instructor's cue. She signaled the salute, her voice ringing clearly. "When you wear this badge, remember, it reflects, not shields. The moment you use it to command fear, you stop earning respect." Outside, the sound of the flag flapping drifted through the open window, morning light casting sideways across the cadets' faces. In their eyes, Selene Ward was no longer just a symbol of the past, but a message for the future. There, within the space of discipline and responsibility, the lesson of respect was rewritten, not in chalk, but in the awakened gaze of those ready to carry it forward. The instructor stood in the center of the lecture hall, morning light pouring through the window, casting a soft halo around her silver-streaked hair. After the cadet's question, the room fell silent, the air thick with only the quiet hum of the projector audible. She turned to look at the screen, where the final frame of Selene Ward remained frozen, calm eyes, silver epaulets, catching the midday light, wind gently moving the flag behind her. The instructor watched for a long moment, then turned back, her voice low and steady. "Courage isn't loud, it just doesn't blink." The words floated out like a breath, yet seemed to stop the room entirely. Each syllable fell slowly without grandeur, but carried the weight of experience and understanding. Young eyes followed her, some pressing their lips together, some nodding slightly, others still staring at the screen as if trying to find the shape of courage in Selene's eyes. She stepped down the aisle, resting a piece of chalk on the front desk, her voice now softer but sharp as steel. "Bravery is not shouting at danger, it's standing still when the world expects you to move." A cadet in the back row gripped his pen tightly, scribbling fast, the ink shaking slightly with his hand. She looked around the room, gaze moving across every face, then added, "People think courage needs to be seen, but the strongest kind leaves no sound." Her voice faded at the end, quiet, as the moment Selene once stood facing a gun, letting stillness speak in place of everything else. The sound of pens began to rise, soft and steady, spreading through the room like a quiet rhythm. One, then two, then dozens of pens, moving in sync, each soft stroke echoing in the silence. Every cadet bent over their notebook not because they were told to, but because they knew they were writing something worth remembering. Light reflected off the pages, each line of ink, like a silent vow from a new generation. The instructor walked to the window, gazing out at the flag waving above the courtyard. Her voice clear, though quiet. One day, you will face a moment like hers. Don't raise your voice. Raise your standard. Outside, the wind picked up the flag flapping hard against the stillness of the lecture hall. No one spoke. Everyone sat upright, eyes turned toward the flying flag. In that moment, these young people were not just learning about law or authority, but about how to be human in the uniform they were about to wear. The pens continued moving, each stroke carving into the idea that courage needs no applause, no spotlight. It lives in the choice to stand still in a storm. When the lesson ended, no one rushed to leave. They all stayed seated for a few more seconds as if listening to the echo of those final words, "Courage isn't loud, it just doesn't blink." The ceremony was held in the Grand Hall of the Pentagon, where the light from hundreds of crystal chandeliers reflected off the wall engraved with the names of those who had served the nation. At the center stage, the national flag hung with honor, red silk draping down both sides like a frame, for a moment destined to become history. In the audience sat generals, government leaders, veterans, and young cadets in crisp uniforms. As the ceremonial music began, the entire hall rose to their feet, eyes turned toward the figure walking steadily toward the podium, General Selene Ward. The spotlight hit her silver epaulets, making the stars etch their shine. Her face was calm, her stance firm, her eyes clear, reflecting the flag behind her. The host spoke, "Today, we honor General Selene Ward for her contributions to human dignity within the armed forces." When the sentence ended, applause filled the room, deep, steady, full of meaning. Selene bowed her head slightly, her hand resting over the medal on her chest. As she stepped up to speak, the hall fell silent again. She paused a moment, looking at the faces, turned toward her, then spoke, her voice low and firm. "Power without empathy is tyranny." The words rang out like a strike of metal echoing through the space. Her eyes did not lower to read a speech. They stayed fixed on the rows of cadets seated in the back. "We were taught to obey, but obedience means nothing without understanding. Strength built on fear collapses, but strength built on compassion endures." Each word landed with clarity, unwavering, shaped by years of military service that had turned her voice into steel. A young soldier in the audience clenched his hands, eyes shining. An older general in the front row gave a subtle nod, his lips pressed tight, eyes filled with sorrow and pride. Selene continued, "Every badge, every rank, every oath, they mean nothing if we forget the people behind them. Dignity is not a medal, it's the mirror we must face every day." Her voice held no pride, only the resonance of someone who had endured loss and understood what it costs to preserve integrity. The stage lights dimmed slightly, catching the gold of her freshly awarded medal, making it glow softly against the deep green of her uniform. After the speech, the applause lingered, but Selene did not bow in thanks. She simply reached back and touched the national flag behind her, a quiet gesture, but full of meaning. A young cadet whispered to the person next to him, "That's the general from the video, right?" The other replied softly, "Yes, and now she's the voice of every soldier who remembers what honor means." In the back row, an elderly woman with silver hair. Reed's mother sat in silence, her eyes misty, one hand resting over her chest. As Selene stepped down from the podium, the last light of the ceremony fell across the flag, casting her silhouette in its glow. Amid the thunderous applause, her words still echoed, quiet but firm like an oath power. "Without empathy is tyranny." And in that solemn atmosphere, everyone understood that compassion had been restored as an essential part of national honor. The applause swelled like rising waves rolling through the hall of the Pentagon. It wasn't loud or chaotic, but deep and resonant, as if it came from the very core of those who had once understood the true meaning of dignity. The rows of guests stood as one, and their uniforms glowing under the lights, hands clapping steadily like a salute to a symbol. On stage, Selene Ward stood still, her eyes scanning the hall, her face composed yet lit with a quiet brilliance, the kind that comes when self-respect is restored to its rightful place. She didn't smile, only nodded gently, letting the sound fill the sacred space of the ceremony. In that rising crowd in the very last row, a man remained quietly seated, his eyes fixed on her silhouette, Reed Walker. He had come to the ceremony with an unnamed invitation, sitting quietly in the far back where the stage lights reached only half his face. His hair was shorter now, his beard clean-shaven, his face thinner, but his eyes held something different, not defiance or fear, but acknowledgement, regret, and a kind of late-arriving peace. As those around him rose, Reed stood, too, his hand tightening around the edge of the chair. The light angled across the rows and caught his face, making his tearful eyes glimmer. He looked at Selene for a long time, and in that moment all distance between them, rank, race mistakes, days of judgment, seemed to dissolve. Amid the applause, Reed took a deep breath and slowly raised his hand to his chest, right where the badge used to rest, where the light of the flag now softly reflected. The television camera panned across the auditorium and landed on him just as his hand touched his chest. A slow close-up angle caught the light reflecting off a single tear rolling down his cheek, glimmering like a piece of metal caught under the spotlight. The lens shifted, framing him as he stood upright, shoulders squared, eyes fixed on the stage where Selene still stood. In that moment, he was no longer a man who had once failed, but a soldier bowing his head before the most deserving commander he had ever known. No one in the audience recognized him, but the image traveled through the lens, leaving behind a feeling hard to name, silent atonement, painfully real. Selene looked out over the crowd, her eyes passing over him, pausing for half a second. She didn't speak, didn't signal, only raised her hand in salute, a gesture both solemn and exact. Light hit her shoulders, making the metal on her chest gleam. The applause continued rising until the entire hall became a chorus of gratitude. The camera held its final shot, Selene saluting, and Reed still standing, hand over his heart, eyes wet and lifted. In that moment, between two people who had once stood at opposite ends of a barrel, only pure respect remained, the kind that turns justice from judgment into silent redemption. Dawn settled like a breath, a silver mist draping over the rows of white headstones aligned in perfect order. Morning light filtered through layers of fog, reflecting off the flag flying atop the hill, the red stripes glowing as if dyed by the rising sun. Selene Ward walked slowly along the stone path, her boots brushing the gravel in soft rhythm each step, in tune with the quiet heartbeat of morning. In her hands a bouquet of red roses wrapped in a blue ribbon, embroidered with the words, "For those who stood with honor." A gentle breeze moved her hair, and the pale light caught her silver epaulets, making her look as if she'd stepped out of the very history this place preserved. She stopped before a grave, draped in the flag, bent down, placed the flowers on the damp ground, her hand brushing the edge of the stone, her eyes solemn. Everything around her was so still it felt as though one could hear the mist falling onto the grass. Behind Hunters, a group of young cadets stood in formation, their uniforms crisp, their eyes a mix of eagerness and unease. They had come for the first ceremony of the year where honor was not taught but seen. One of them, tall and lean, with bright eyes, stared at Selene for a long moment before stepping forward, his voice quiet. "Ma'am, how do we know right from wrong?" The question came gently, enough to stir the mist and make a few others turn to look. Selene lifted her gaze, her eyes reflecting the muted light, calm and deep, like undisturbed water. She looked at him for a long time, then answered slowly, "You don't always know. You feel it first before you understand it." She stood, turned to the group now listening intently, and added her voice low and steady. "Rules tell you what to do. Conscience tells you why." The group stayed silent. A girl in the line bowed her head, hands clasped tightly as if trying to hold on to every word. Selene took a few steps into the center aisle, her eyes scanning the white stones stretching toward the horizon, then continued, her voice soft but far-reaching. We wear the same uniform, but each of us carries a different truth. The hardest part is to keep that truth clean. The early wind swept harder, and the flag in the distance flapped sharply, the sound of fabric like the voices of the fallen echoing back. Selene turned to the young faces watching her. She nodded slightly, her voice like a closing note. Justice doesn't begin with command. It begins with how we treat others when no one is watching. Then she bowed to the flag. The sun's first light pierced the mist falling across the cemetery like a golden cloth. The cadets stood silently at attention, no words spoken. As Selene walked away, dew clung to her boots, glinting like tiny mirrors catching the morning light. Above them, the flag soared higher, brighter, redder, like the nation's salute to those who held the line of honor and taught the next generation to know right from wrong, not through words, but by the way they lived. That morning, dawn stretched over the national cemetery like a ribbon of silver, gentle light settling over rows of white headstones where stories of honor, failure, and awakening had ended in silence. From the turbulent noon at Arlington, when a police officer named Reed Walker drew his gun, during a military funeral to this morning, where Selene Ward, the woman who once stood before that gun, laid a bouquet of red roses on a flag-covered grave. Everything seemed to have come full circle in the way justice was meant to exist quietly, without spectacle, but with gravity. Their story was not a tragedy, but a journey of human beings confronting the darkest parts of themselves in order to reclaim the light of dignity. From the moment Reed raised his weapon in a sacred place, the world witnessed how fragile ethics can become when power strays from compassion. Selene didn't respond with anger. She met it with composure, with a gaze that saw beyond fear. Her action forced society to look inward, made those wearing a badge ask themselves what had made them forget the meaning of to serve. When Selene's true identity was revealed, a general who had dedicated decades of service to her country, it wasn't just a shock to the officer, but a reckoning for the entire system. Her silence in the face of insult became the loudest voice, a reminder that strength is not in domination, but in retaining humanity when tested. The investigation, the trial, and the storm of debate in the media were never about punishment, but about facing how a society functions. Reed lost his badge, but what he truly lost was the trust of those who once believed in the values he swore to uphold. Still, even in that downfall, there flickered a trace of redemption from the look he gave Selene at the national tribute to the hand he placed over his chest in salute. That image, captured on camera, became a symbol of remorse, a quiet testimony that people are not defined forever by their failures, but by how they face them. Selene continued her path not through titles, but through humility. Her statement before Congress: because the uniform shouldn't determine respect, humanity should transcend it, a hearing, and became a compass for an entire generation of young officers. She didn't make herself a hero, but a reflection of conviction. In the police academy classroom, when Selene's image was shown again, the instructor said, "Courage isn't loud, it just doesn't blink." And there, in the eyes of cadets taking notes, her legacy could be seen, a lesson in courage that required no applause, measured instead by calm resolve in choosing what's right. In the end, as Selene walked through the cemetery at dawn, her answer to the young recruit echoed as a simple yet profound conclusion: when you respect before you judge. That line captured the entire arc of the story, a reminder that respect is the foundation of all justice, and that judgment, if it comes before understanding, will always lead people into error. The morning sunlight shining on her silver epaulets, reflecting off the flag waving overhead, became the final image of a timeless truth. Honor is not a reward, but a responsibility. The story of Selene Ward and Reed Walker is a mirror held up to society where our skin color, prejudice, and humanity confront each other every day. But above all, it reminds viewers that justice does not need to shout, because truth already has its own voice strong enough to make people bow their heads. The lesson left behind is not in the applause, but in the final silence, when people realize that courage is not about defeating others, but about overcoming themselves. And in the moment when dawn breaks over the National Cemetery, where rows of white headstones reflect the light, people understand that the world can only change when we learn to respect before we judge and dare to face the truth to keep our conscience as clear as the flag flying in the sky.